Hi. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. Yeah, oh, how can I not love that?
Our first time.
I was going to ask if anybody is here for the first time. Well, especially to first-timers, welcome, and I hope it's not your last time. You should come back. Come back to programs. Come back to this room, which during the day is adorned with couches and coffee tables and other places for people to work and meet and just hang and have a cup of coffee. And come back and use our really extraordinary collection upstairs, where you can research anything that relates to Brooklyn, Long Island history. We have the most comprehensive collection really in the world since we became part of the Brooklyn Public Library and merged what was the Center for the Brooklyn Historical Society and the Brooklyn Public Libraries to Brooklyn Collections. So people come here and they research history, they research houses, they research genealogy. There's a lot of reasons to come back. Anyway, my name is Marcia Eli, and I get to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Brooklyn History, on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, and BPL Presents, which is the arts and culture team. Tonight we're excited to host Jane Kamensky, whose new book, Candida Royalle and the Sexual Revolution, tells the story of an improbable heroine. Candida Royalle was a porn performer and later a director-producer who co-founded Femme Productions. The book interweaves intimate biography and cultural history, and the New York Times calls it a labor of empathy that refuses to simplify or valorize its subject. Candida Royalle and the Sexual Revolution is the most recent of Jane Kamensky's many books, which include A Revolution in Color, The World of John Singleton Copley, winner of the New York Historical Society's American History Book Prize. And for 30 years, Kamensky worked as a history professor and higher education leader, most recently as Trumbull Professor of American History at Harvard University and director of the Schlesinger Library at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Earlier this year, she became the president of Monticello and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. Leading her in conversation tonight is writer Cynthia Carr, author most recently of Candy Darling, Dreamer, Icon, Superstar. Her previous books are Fire in the Belly, The Life and Times of David Wojnarowicz, winner of a Lambda Literary Award and finalist for the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize, Our Town, A Heartland Lynching, A Haunted Town, and the Hidden History of White America, and On Edge, Performance at the End of the 20th Century. Carr chronicled, as many of you may have read, as I did, the work of contemporary artists as a Village Voice staff writer in the 1980s and 1990s. So after their conversation, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions. We'll bring a microphone around. As you may have seen as you came in, we have the book at the CBH shop. I hope that you will explore it, you will look at it, you will buy it. Jane has agreed to sign it, and so we have a table in the front that will be a place for you to continue the conversation and have her sign your book following the program. So please help, we're so excited actually to have both of you here, so welcome, welcome. Please help me welcome them to the stage.
Is this working? Oh. Okay. Now, I know, Jane, you are a historian, and you specialized in like early American history?
But I
right?
drifted.
Pardon?
But I drifted.
Yes. I was going to say, Candida Royalle, it's sort of a leap from Dolly Madison and that sort of world.
Okay, not Dolly Madison. Yeah.
Okay. So how did this biography come about?
So it's an archive story. In a lot of ways, it's fitting that we're in a special collections libraries space tonight. I became the director of Harvard's Schlesinger Library, which is the world's leading library on the history of American women, in September of 2015, which was the same month that Candida Royalle died, an untimely early death at the age of 64. And her obituary ran above the fold in the New York Times with a headline saying that she was a feminist pornographer. And Schlesinger held the papers of Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin and others who had battled on the anti-pornography side of the feminist so-called sex wars of the 1970s, late 1970s and 1980s. But we had very little on the sex positive side and really nothing coming out of somebody who had an experience of working in pornography, making pornography, nothing from the inside out. And so I began as the director of that library to pursue the archive, not knowing whether it existed or whether we were the right place for it. I came to Candace's Judson Church Memorial Service and passed out my business card. And saw in the slideshow that remembered her remarkable life that there were many written documents, many mentions in the remarks about diaries and letters, and was in touch that night and beyond with her Club 90 connoisseur, Veronica Vera, who is here with us tonight, who had become the keeper of that collection, which then did come to Schlesinger Library. And really it was just the remarkable quality of this person's record of her own life that made me first think I needed to teach a course about it. And then after I had taught a course about the feminist sex wars, leading students into that collection, realized that the life wouldn't let me go until I wrote a book about it.
So you had access to all her journals. Could you talk about them? Like, when did she start writing the journals? How many were there, or that kind of thing?
So the first things that she kept that survive in this archive are girlhood birthday cards from the age of 9. She was journaling by the time she was 12. So her first journal was in 1963, one of those little leatherette page-a-day diaries with a lock that couldn't keep her father out, but that's a story in and of itself. And she kept a nearly continuous run of journals until 10 days before she passed at the age of 64. An impulse that even when her life was chaotic, she was journaling on the back of phone bills and in loose leaf notebooks. So a kind of relentless chronicler of her own life, a pretty good diagnostician of her own life. She saw the world around her even as she looked in at her own experience. So the collection's about 112 archival boxes, letters, diaries, business records from Femme Production Company, her feminist erotic film company founded in 1984, videotapes of all of her TV appearances, most of the films that she acted in and all of the films she made, behind the scenes things. As one of the first people into the archive after it left Veronica's hands, I had the incredible experience of pulling things out of boxes and to have feathers and glitter come out of some of them. She really kept a record of her whole life. If she destroyed anything, I don't know it.
Wow. What a
impassive face from Veronica.
What a find for a biographer, I know, for myself. You had said that It would have been harder for you to do this book if you'd been able to talk to her. And I wondered about that. Like, why is that?
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about that with you because you've worked on people who you did either know well or brush elbows with. So as a historian of ye olden days, right, my previous books were in the 17th, 18th, early 19th century of American history. I was pretty used to doing with people what I will, right? There was no previous book that I ever worked on had anyone left alive to talk back. And it was a novel experience for me to have the honor of talking to the people in Candace's life, almost all of whom are still alive because she died at 64. Right, she died so young that that her friends, her sister, are not only still living but are young and vital. It was new and in many ways wonderful to feel accountable to them, not as somebody writing an authorized biography, but as somebody who needed to get it right in a way that someone who knew her could talk back to. I think if I had had to talk back to her, it would have felt like too small a box for the kind of history that I wanted to do. I think the other enabling factor of the people who survived Candace and who were wonderful witnesses to her life and generous interviewees to me is she made her life an open book, and they too were incredibly open about her life and their lives, and had none of the impulse that I had seen in the anti-pornography people whose collections we hold, which was to lock their material down unless somebody agreed with their own view of their own life. I remember Annie Sprinkle saying, have at it. We don't need anything from you. We know her. We know who she was to us. Tell her who she is. Tell us who she was in American history. Or Veronica, after the book came out, and the book has some very tough things to say about her. After the book came out, saying, Veronica, I don't know if you'll recall this, I realized that I don't need you to be the person who remembers that she loved coffee ice cream, because I keep that memory alive. So I don't think it's every recently passed person whose social network would feel that way about casting that bread upon the waters for some random historian who never knew her, who had never, in fact, known of her life and work before that obituary ran in the Times. Yeah. But I didn't get to sit down with her, and in some ways I'm glad I didn't.
Oh, yeah. I know that writing the book, say, about Candy, actually the response that's meant the most to me is from people who knew her and said, you got it right. That really meant the most to me.
I would say the same. It's been an incredible experience for me because nobody is alive from 1815 to tell me that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In terms of her life, I don't think she set out in life to become a porn star. She went to college, and seemed to be interested in art. Wanted to be an illustrator, but something got derailed there. What happened?
I think I blame San Francisco. So she it's a Brooklyn, Nassau County story. She was born in Hempstead. Her grandmother lived on President Street in Cobble Hill. Family knocked around the outer boroughs, made its way up to Riverdale, an aspirational place where I think the horizon of an Italian-American working class family cracked open with college-bound classmates or parents of classmates who had been to college. She went to Parsons and then to City, and got involved in a feminist group in the Bronx, which was doing incredible work. But she was listening to a lot of Joni Mitchell up there in the Central Bronx, singing about California. Her high school boyfriend had gone out and come back from San Francisco and had a scheme to open a rock club in a derelict synagogue that he was going to call the House of Good instead of the House of God. There was a pull of the counterculture, right? The idea that things would be brighter, less square. And she went out there in early 1972 in a red Toyota Corolla with 3 other people from her feminist consciousness raising group, and no plan at all. Sort of a character out of Joan Didion's Slouching Towards Bethlehem a couple years after the Summer of Love. One of the things that was amazing about San Francisco in the early 1970s was it was cheap. She got a room in a Victorian in the Haight for $30 a month. Under Governor Ronald Reagan, not only was abortion legal before it was almost anywhere else in the United States, but there was a massive statewide Social Security program called Aid for the Totally Disabled, which funded artists who didn't want to be in square jobs. So she did alternate theater. She was a sort of Coquettes adjacent, for those in the audience who know the work of the acid drag troupe, the Coquettes, in the early 1970s. She came in and out of groups called the Angels of Light, Warped Floors. There were a lot of these theater groups that came and went. She had training in high school and at Parsons in commercial illustration. She did a little of that, little this, a little of that, and then a lot of acid and a lot of heroin. And I think in this sort of counterculture gig economy, porn was always one degree of separation. Most of the people who I talked to in her San Francisco circle had done a little light sex work of one kind or another. Nude encounter booths where you would sit naked and someone would come and talk to you on the other side of a mirror. Dates for pay, like you used to see in the back pages of the Village Voice. And this was the moment, the same year she went to San Francisco was the same year Deep Throat came out. It was the moment of so-called porno chic, where porn was showing in theatrical release for mixed audiences. And San Francisco was a hub of production. So it was I think it wasn't a plan, it was a gig. And many times in the 70s, she wrote like, well, that was good for a laugh, I'm done. And I think more than she had anticipated, the gig became an occupation in San Francisco and then in LA in the Boogie Nights years. She wrote a lot in her private diaries about stigma. And I think one of the things that fascinates me about her story is the anti-pornography feminists did view her as pimped and trafficked. Completely false to her own experience. Some of the more hedonic, sex-positive feminists would view her as somebody who made expressive choices, true but incomplete to her own experience. And I think she found by the end of the 70s that being in pornographic films was not a door that you could walk out of as easily as you could walk into. She waited a long time for her break in straight entertainment, and it didn't come. So in the solidarity that she was part of called Club 90, everybody had acted in explicit movies. Some became fine artists, like Annie Sprinkle, doing performance art. Some became writers, entrepreneurs of various kinds in the sex industry and around its edges. And Candace had the idea with another friend who came out of came out of Minnesota, to sort of flip the script. What if we did this for women rather than to women? And that became her project in the 80s.
Right. You said, that she joined a women's group very early on, like 1970, and you described her in the book as an instinctive feminist. What did you mean by that?
Sorry, I should have taken the cap off the bottle. Yeah, I think an instinctive feminist in the sense that, like any American woman born in 1950, so she's a creature exactly of the mid-century, she grew up with a double standard that she realized by the time she began keeping diaries, right, as a 12 and 13-year-old, was fundamentally unfair. She was not reading Our Bodies, Ourselves. She was reading 17 magazine, and being told, I think as a beautiful, charismatic, and highly sexed person, that was fine for he, but not for her. And by the time she was in 9th grade, she knew this was bullshit. And when she entered the women's collective of the Bronx umbrella leftist group, I think that gave it a name, right? It was, as Friedan said, the year that Candace started keeping diaries, she had experienced the problem that had no name, and she joined a feminist solidarity that had her reading Friedan and other things, where she was able to say, okay, this kind of unfair is a double standard, and it's been there for 5,000 years, and it had a particularly noxious variety for her generation, where girls were told to aspire, maybe more than their mothers, more than my mother, who was born in 1933, but not to aspire too much, right? Like that, you could go to college, but you would meet a nice man there. So it was that sense of what we might call patriarchy, that I think came instinctively to her in a vernacular way. She left organized feminism in '72 because she was sick of being told that she couldn't do it with lipstick and heels. And I think also is an illustration of the ways that the cultural turn in feminism, the policing of bodies and advertisements and personal expression, was a pretty limiting box for somebody who really wanted to advance the rest of the program, right, of equality.
Right. When did she start using the name Candida Royalle?
Candida Royalle was New Year's Eve of 1974, and it came out of underground theater. And the way that I know, the way we can date it is she's doodling it around the last page of the diary she used between 1971 and 1974. So it was a stage name for her work with Warped Floors and the Angels of Light.
Not connected to porn.
Not connected to porn. She said it sounded like a fancy French dessert. And it became, so her first pornographic films as an actress were in 1975, and she used it unevenly in the mid-'70s. She oscillated through a bunch of nom de porn, and it became the name that I think was the name of her public self. I think, she writes quite eloquently in the 90s and 2000s about meeting people, especially meeting men who wanted to know Candida, and she wanted to be known as Candace. So I think it was always an outward-facing performative self, but it didn't start in porn.
Right. And in some of the early porn films, she was Candace. But,
yeah, she was Candice Royale. She was. I have a spreadsheet somewhere of all the names in those films, and some of the films that she acted in were these brief 8-minute loops, which don't even have credits. I mean, I'm sure there are still lost performances. This real ephemera.
Right. But she kept those loops or a lot of those things.
She did not keep all of the loops. She was disgusted by the loops. It was terrible work. And she called it the lowest rung of the ladder of explicit production. They were compiled in the video age. You know, her story and the place that she found her niche in feminist erotica is also a story of the history of technology. So the age of video opened certain possibilities. One was for her to make a kind of explicit erotic movie, feature-length movie, that was designed for couples, heterosexual couples, to watch at home on their couch together. That same video technology resuscitated some of these old loops and bundled them, and she was furious about that. So some of those survived in the collection.
Might have to explain how loops are different from the porn film.
Yeah, so a loop is a single can of 8mm or 16mm analog film that was meant to run in a machine in a peep show over, like you paid the quarter and you got a loop. The grammar of the conventional feature-length porn film is 6 acts, 6 completed sex acts shown by male ejaculation. A loop had 1. And they were enormously profitable for the people who made them and paid their talent, barely enough to have lunch, right? There were days in 1975 where she was making 2 a day. And then in these spaces, in these arcades, the people who owned those spaces and frequently rumored that the mafia was on the collecting end, as it was for many cash businesses, made a fortune in quarters. So they're true ephemera. There are, when I was still at Schlesinger Library, we would hear of, somebody died and there was a wall of loops in their garage, but most libraries don't have them, and she didn't keep the original. She may not have ever gotten a copy. Right. This was the most kind of evanescent of day work.
Right. It seems when she moved to LA, it seems like she was thinking about trying to get into Hollywood film and maybe leave porn behind. Is that right?
I think, she, especially in the milieu of erotic film, she was a real class act, right? Like she could hit her lines, she could play a character. She did a lot of her work as a pornographic actress in her own vintage fashion. These weren't films that had a budget for costumes, and I think she was an artist who had the potential for success in many media. She was a visual artist. I got a tattoo at the end of the book of one of her drawings on my arm. She could sing, was a compelling jazz singer, and she had camera presence, whose legitimate outlet wound up being the talk show. But Hollywood was not open to her. Some of the people who she had worked with in 70s theatrically released porn had occasional roles in Hollywood films. Her Club 90 sister, Jane Hamilton, aka Veronica Hart, has a 2-minute stint in Boogie Nights. But it was pretty atypical for somebody to emerge from the world of pornography and go into straight film. I think there's a wonderful oral history of the LA porn industry by Legs McNeil, where a number of people talk about where's the greater cynicism, right? Like that these actors, especially women, were too tainted for Hollywood films. But in porn, you knew what you had to do to get the job, and in Hollywood, it was the Harvey Weinstein approach. So I think she was a commentator on that cynicism and another kind of double standard in Hollywood filmmaking, but she never made the leap.
Wonder if you could maybe describe what the sex wars were. I mean, maybe, I know you taught a whole course on it, but, a brief description of what, I think it started in the 70s already, and I...
Started in the late 70s. By 1978, 1979, there were a kind of strong group of theoretical feminists who decided that pornography was the single greatest threat to women's equality, that it was the cause, not the symptom of inequality. I think a belief in the way that culture works that went pretty deep, and that was very powerful in San Francisco and then in New York. First Take Back the Night march was 1978 in San Francisco, marching through the Tenderloin and asking to shut theaters as places of exploitation. One of the, I think, there are two truly unfortunate things about the anti-side in the sex wars. One is that the incredibly gifted thinkers and organizers of anti-pornography feminism took their eyes off a whole lot of other balls. There's a statement that I quote in the book out of the San Francisco chapter of NOW in 1986, where the president of that chapter says, getting rid of pornography is more fundamental to women's equality than fighting for reproductive rights. How does that sound in 2024, right? Where reproductive rights failed as a feminist cause, it failed. And anti-pornography also failed. We don't actually, this is big news to the younger people in the audience, but we don't live in a world of less pornography than in 1986. So that was one tragedy of anti-pornography feminism. The other one was that it turned feminists against each other. So cleaved the energy for women's equality at the grassroots level all across the country, and became as heated a battle as it was between feminists and pornographers, between feminists and other kinds of feminists. The sort of New York landmark of this is the so-called Barnard Conference of 1982, the Ninth Scholar and the Feminist Conference, where feminists were picketing other feminists, accusing them of false consciousness, comparing anti-pornography feminists. Most sex-positive feminists were not pro-porn, but anti-porn, accusing them of being like capos in concentration camps. I mean, just hideous horizontal hostility within feminism. The irony of those wars, which burned hot until the mid-1990s, and I think come back in other shapes even now, and we could talk about that in the Q&A. The irony of them for Candace was that it gave her her place in straight media as a spokesperson. So the heyday of anti-pornography feminism was also the heyday of the daytime talk show. And the daytime talk show loved the format where you put people against each other who might wind up screaming. Right. And especially women, right? It was scripted for the cat fight. And among people in the sex industry, Candace and her Club 90 sister, Gloria Leonard, the publisher of High Society and a really important First Amendment advocate, were the most elegant, the most poised, the most suitable from a talk show producer's, if you're Phil Donahue and you need to put somebody up next to Catherine McKinnon, Candida Royalle became that person with her own grace and her move to found Femme films behind her, right? So she had a set of talking points, which was that the solution to the problem of pornography was not carceral, was not to clamp down on pornography, but to have women become both producers and consumers who could tell the story of what they wanted in their own erotic lives. And that was a very telegenic message. So she was on Donahue, she was on Sally Jessy Raphael, she was on Dr. Ruth's show, she was on the Today Show with Jane Pauley, who, by the way, treated her terribly. The sex wars were very, very good to Candace in a way.
I know there's a documentary about Andrea Dworkin that I've seen where one of the producers announced, gave an introduction by saying that Andrea Dworkin became best known for her worst idea, and it's sort of the true thing. But so when she started directing films, did that come directly out of the sex wars, or was it it started a little differently than that, I think?
I think she really was not a creature of the sex wars until she had her directorial experience behind her. So the first femme film is in 1984. I think it comes out of her, both her righteous sense that women deserved their own erotic pleasure out loud, and her entrepreneurial instinct that there was money to be made serving the half the population that she had seen personally as an actress so incredibly ill-served by a lot of male-run conventional pornography. It was the age of MTV and the VCR. VHS had just won the format wars, and the original conceit was that they were going to make explicit rock videos for women. And the first two femme films have that rock video. It's MTV with fucking. Have that rock video format. The jump cutting, the leather, the downtown spaces. They're your East Village spaces from the 70s come back as sets by the mid 80s. In short vignettes. Then her third femme film and beyond became more long form narrative, and the business idea was women could rent half these films or more if anybody served them something that they would wander into the back room of a video store to pick out and not feel ashamed of. Same moment that Good Vibrations is starting, right? That businesses that serve women's erotic lives unashamedly are coming out of the plain brown wrapper. So that's the sort of entrepreneurial impulse behind Femme. I don't think from the archive that she's following the sex wars, especially until she gets the microphone in her face about what Catherine McKinnon said.
Was she still making porn, appearing in porn films herself when she was directing them? Or?
No, she had moved to what in the ballet would be character roles by 1980 or 1981, walk-ons, often clothed. I think one of the ways that conventional porn of that period was cruel to women was it fetishizes novelty. It's the image of the male consumer who's picking up a new woman every night, rather than seeing the latest Candida Royalle production. So she was, in industry parlance, shot out within about. She had a 6-year run as an actress. Was actually long.
Oh, was she the first woman to make porn films?
She was not the first woman to make porn films, but she was the first to make it making porn films. I mean, I think there had been other directors, other actresses who had made a film or two. There were women who were producing in the male-dominated industry, but she was the first to make feminist porn a brand, I think, for sure. And with maybe this is where the visual artist came back in with a kind of unerring sense of, this stuff should be packaged like Apple, not packaged like a Sabrett hot dog. So cared a lot about what the box would look like, what the credits would look like, what the music and what the lighting looked like within the film. She had a really strong sense of what a middle class, straight, white female consumer might feel comfortable watching at home. One of the most amazing things in the archive is there are boxes and boxes of fan mail. And her customers were every woman. People writing on Muppet stationery using their husband's last names, Mrs. Frank so-and-so, saying, dear Candida Royalle, I feel funny saying this. But your movie opened a world to me. She had an unerring sense not only of what that person wanted to see, but what the product might look like to reach her.
So what was the difference between her films and the traditional porn films?
The biggest single difference in visual grammar is that she didn't show male ejaculation. She thought that if people were actually experiencing pleasure, you would be able to see it without ropes of semen on somebody's face. She was adamant about that, including when her father-in-law, who was her business partner, said, you just can't sell a film. They call it the money shot for a reason.
Yeah.
You can't sell a film without it. And she sold 20. She often worked with actor couples who knew each other, and I think very much wanted to show passion that was genuine. And there are a lot of moments in the films that she directed where there's role play that kind of mocks the script of conventional pornography, but when the gambit flips, you learn that they're married and that they're her mother's taking care of the kids for the night. So there's a both visually and narratively there's a gentleness to them. I think she was very sensitive to social class, including her own, right? She's born working class. Her high school boyfriend said, "We'll tell you we were lower middle class, but we were really, what we were was poor. We were poor white ethnics." His parents had survived the Holocaust. Her parents had come out of all kinds of hard scrabble, right? Born before the Depression. When she moved to Riverdale, she saw middle class life, upper middle class life for the first time, and she really wanted to be that thing. And the femme films care about class. There are moments where a mother instructs a daughter, no, the knife goes on the right, the fork goes on the left if you're going to set the table in this beautiful way. That's where the salad fork goes. Right. I think you can tell in femme films that she's reading Martha Stewart Living.
Oh. How many films did she make? 20?
20.
20. Are they still available?
They are. So now they're all, it is the fate of all Golden Age and video porn. They're all on the tubes. You can get them, I think on her website, you can get them as DVDs. But they have been, in many ways, cut up and made into loops, right? Where just the sex acts are isolated from the narrative that she wrote porn films that had 60-page scripts. Wow. The film she was in had 2-page scripts.
Right. Right. There were more of a story in her films.
More of a story.
Yeah.
Women care about the story.
Right. Yeah. Boy, how can that be legal that they would cut them into loops? I don't know. It just doesn't.
Well, I mean, I think, this was a femme, femme was more culturally successful than it was financially successful. So She had a lot of TV appearances. She's quoted in all of the major women's magazines, some major news magazines. The bottom line was pretty weak. And, these are not film companies that have powerful lawyers defending their IP, right? So I think that living close to the edge of what's illicit has meant that the work is vulnerable in ways that are different from if you were going after Miramax and putting it up on Pornhub.
So did she end up making a lot of money while doing
She did
this?
not end up making a lot of money. I mean, I think she ended up, I think one of her big goals in her financial life was to own a house. She owned a house. She traveled internationally. She earned a measure of respect that was far less than she deserved.
Right.
But she did not get rich. And I think safe to say that nobody in porn got stupid rich. I mean, the tubes now are generating far more money than even the major male-dominated players ever did. Larry Flint wound up broke. Guccione wound up nearly broke. There were not big fortunes in any of it for the men. And the women who really wanted to do something that approached art, I think, were fighting for table scraps.
Wow. Before you were mentioning Club 90, this is something that's always sort of interested me as what a great idea. Could you talk about what that was, how it started?
So Club 90 was a solidarity of former porn performers named after Annie Sprinkle's apartment at 90 Lexington Avenue, now a very fashionable neighborhood and not then. I think they had gotten together for a baby shower for Veronica Hart, Wanda of Wanda Whips Wall Street. And wound up dancing late into the night and realizing how much that they could share together that nobody else really understood or shared, and it became a kind of feminist consciousness-raising circle for people who had come through the porn industry. It was not a recovery group. I think they understood themselves as having had a distinctive experience that they recognized in each other and through which they could backstop each other, but not an experience of trauma that needed salving. That's my sense of the kind of support that they had. They did a performance at Franklin Furnace
Yes.
In the mid '80s that dramatized one of their meetings as a play. It was lifelong for the core members who are still having reunions. Originally a group of 6 or 7 that really concentrated in a group of 5. I think all of whose papers either are or will be at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. So a generation of people who are interested in this very question will be able to study what they were to each other in their own words.
Right. That's great. Is it time to turn to the audience and see if there are any questions out there? Anybody?
Hello. Thank you guys so much. Can't wait to read the book. I was just wondering, what would you say are like the 3 greatest films that Candice made as a director?
I think she would say Three Daughters, which was her 3rd femme film, and the one that continued to sell forever was her, was the greatest realization of the vision. I think the first 2, Femme and Urban Heat, which are those MTV-like films, are I think visually they still look very fresh. They're doing a lot of things that new wave cinema did. I would say those first three would be the top three. She experimented in interesting ways as the director owner of Femme, which did sell out in the 1990s and to a larger distributor. The films become a good bit more conventional after that, but the early ones are really quite different from what she was acting in.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This is so fascinating. I'm curious about her feminist influences as a young person. So, I mean, maybe was her mother or her parents, were they role models in this way? Or I know you can live and get these experiences, but how was she introduced to these ideas?
Quite the opposite, I would say. I think it was that her own family was so fundamentally unfair to her and her sister that she bootstrapped a kind of feminist consciousness. So her biological mother, left her and her sister when she was an infant. She never saw her again. Her stepmother, who held the family together in a lot of ways, was also a drinker and a screamer, and I think willfully blind to the fact that Candace's father was a kind of predator. So her own family was fundamentally unfair. School was fundamentally unfair to girls. It wasn't the Virgin Mary who was very present in her life. It wasn't her grandmother. I think she had to be the role model she didn't have, and it didn't come from a book. Because she was this archive maniac and kept everything. I can see what she was reading in her feminist consciousness raising group. And she didn't say, "Oh my God, Betty Friedan changed my life." Schlesinger Library also holds Betty Friedan's papers. 10,000 people wrote to Betty Friedan and said, "Your book changed my life." Candace wasn't one of them. Counterculture literature, to a degree, I think, made her open to inequality. Right, like she thought the Vietnam War was unfair. She grew up with a set of conventional racial prejudices and came to believe that they were very unfair. She was homophobic. She came, the counterculture, led her through a journey around sexuality. But I think it really was quite bootstrapped. If she had a role model, it was later when she had the sisterhood of Club 90.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have two questions, but I'll start with, I'd love to hear more about your process. Like, I know that you're brought this archive into the library, and it sounds from the kinds of things that she was collecting and just the sheer volume of it. Like, how did you start?
At the beginning, right? The first thing that I pulled out of the archive, boxes came in not in random order, but not in chronological order, was something from the sex wars years. And I had brought to the sort of staff processing floor of this library a colleague from Harvard Law School who works on the feminist sex wars, Janet Halley. I was like, we're unboxing this collection. You want to come see a live unboxing video? And we pulled out this thing where, she's talking back to McKinnon and Dworkin from the perspective of an industry veteran. And Janet said, I've never seen anything like that. There's nothing like this. So then I think the historian's question is always, okay, where did it start? Like, what's the earliest thing? So the first thing I did was to read the diaries through from beginning to end, which are like a novel. To read everything in the surround of her world that I could, although I had moments, this will be boring to most people, but as working on the 17th and 18th century is like those ancient Greek vases that you see that are put back together in the Met, where there's like a couple little pieces of illustration and it's all terracotta, and you're so thrilled when you find one piece of something. And this was a flood of archive, right? The 20th century was fundamentally, I could tell you what she was doing almost every day of her life. The place that I was sort of least thorough and most selective was in the business records of her production company. There's still a great book to be written there about femme films as a business. I think working in the late 20th, 21st century is a world of sampling. She was a born digital creature by the time that she died. And this was the first research I've ever done that involved a hard drive and searching emails. That made me realize that I don't want to be a researcher in email, right? She didn't really live deeply into the world of social, and I'm really grateful for that.
And if it's okay, my second question for you.
Yeah, sorry. I think there was somebody over here. You.
I guess my question is, like, after reading all of everything about her life, do you think that she was satisfied with her life, or do you think she had like major regrets?
I missed the first part. Do I think she was?
Do you think she was satisfied with her life overall, or do you think she had major regrets?
Don't we all? Right? I mean, I think she was amazed at what she had accomplished and the sheer fortitude of building a life of considerable beauty given where she had come from. I think her life was also filled with regret, which is what it is for most people to be human. I don't think she wound up writing herself into an anti-pornography story, although this is the counterfactual. Would she wish she had never done porn? Probably not. I think she was somebody who wanted to try everything. She might wish she had never done heroin. Yeah. It's coming back to you.
Thank you. So I thought you did a really great job in the book of like talking about the relationship with her sister and the sexual infidelity and the way that changed their relationship. But there was something that struck me that you said in the book where she called home and told her stepmother that she'd done porn. And I hope that I'm getting this right because I might be misremembering it, but you said that Helen said something along the lines of like, good for you, let's not tell your father. And I'm curious because she surrounded herself with, other people in the porn industry and built this really strong safety net. But I'm really curious about how her family of origin grappled with her profession and also her success over time.
So she had extruded herself pretty substantially from her family of origin, certainly by the time she came back from California. I asked her high school boyfriend. So her high school boyfriend lived on the Grand Concourse, a less elevated part of the Bronx than she did. They were in San Francisco together. He came back, went to Cardozo, and became an estate lawyer. And I said, how did you come from this same place and be that? And she, I think going back to your question about regrets, she had a lot of regrets about the period between, say, 76 and 79. She really fell through the one-way mirror in those years. So, how did you come back and get really the most boring job I can imagine? And she, are you an estate lawyer? No, and she, had a heroin addiction that was very hard to break and that affected, I think, fundamentally all of her life choices in that period. And he said it was all about whether you had a family that loved you enough to come and get you. And he did, and she didn't. So I think that her contact with her family of origin, except for her sister, was quite sporadic in her adult life. What they thought of her, what she thought of them. She became close to her cousins again, her Brooklyn cousins, a sort of thick network of Italian cousins in Cobble Hill, and cared deeply about them and their children. Her mother and father were dead to her long before they passed, I think, and justifiably so.
We have time for one more question. If anybody has another question, a final question.
So I'm wondering what you would think about Candace's legacy, and maybe this is a good wrap-up question. What lives on? What should we remember? And where do we go from here?
I think her perseverance stands out to me more than almost anything else. I mean, she has a body of work as a director that should be judged as a cultural intervention in and of itself by film scholars, which I am not. I think her life shows how fundamentally savage and destructive the sex wars were to combatants on all sides and to the project of women's equality in general. And the fact that she came through it with grace and dignity and strong human relationships, I think she has a powerful legacy of what it means to be human. And the ways that an ordinary person, and this is really what made me want to write this book, is that Candace lived a life that is almost like a kind of life that is almost always told from the outside in, and usually by reformers, right? Don't do drugs. All the things that I've told my own children, who, by the way, are here. Partner well, take care of people, take care of your body. Cautionary tale. She refused to be somebody's cautionary tale. She insisted on telling the story of her own life. She tried to write it several times. She was not an author in long form, though she wrote a lot of short form things mostly in sex periodicals. But I think she, to me as a historian, she shows the value of listening to ordinary people as they tell their own story and trying to make sense of how they understood themselves rather than trying to put somebody in a box.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful conversation. It's a wonderful book. If you've read it, I'm sure there's someone else that you want to give it to. So please explore the book, flip through it, come talk more to Jane at the table in the front, and thank you all for being here. And thank you for that wonderful conversation. Thank you.